Today is the new moon in Gemini, and it's forming a relationship with Neptune in Pisces. And the theme that's emanating from this relationship is it's time for you to give up this idea, stop practicing faking it until you make it, because it's actually interrupting you getting your needs met. So, in this episode, what I'm going to be doing is sharing some insights that's going to help you navigate what's potentially a tension point between the sun and the moon. It's this new moon, so it's new beginnings for you to set new intentions. And it's in the sign of Gemini, which is ruled by Mercury, which is all about communication. And it's about how do you navigate your way back to ensuring that your needs are honored and met. Before I dive into any of that, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Bybreen and I help baby boomers reinvent themselves psychologically, practically, and technically so they can thrive in their third act of life. And if you're one of my regulars, welcome. I also want to say that I've received some wonderful messages. So, this idea of Mercury, which rules Gemini, is all about communication. So I've received wonderful messages. Somebody called Shaden sent a message this morning saying how much he enjoys the channel and he's going to be sharing my message, which is wonderful. And then I received a message from Karen Carpenter, who's recouping in hospital, and Mark Watson and Maria Marshall. So thank you to everybody that supports the channel. But it really is an indication and a representation of this new moon in Gemini. Also, I forgot to mention Sean Washington as well. So, what does it mean? The power to communicate what it is that you really need, and why you must give up this idea of faking it until you make it, because it really is interrupting your own development. So, let's break down the concept of this new moon. The new moon in Gemini is an opportunity for you to blend this new message. It's about how do you honor your solar identity represented by the sun, as well as your emotional identity represented by the moon. And the moon underpins, it always supports the sun. Now, when you have a square in astrology, that's known as an internal tension point. And the square is with an outer planet called Neptune. Now, Neptune's really powerful here because Neptune is dignified in Pisces, meaning that it rules, it's in the sign that it rules. And when Pisces and Neptune come together, they don't like this idea of relationships. And when we're looking at astrological signatures, what it is about how do these planets form a relationship with each other. So, with regards to the sun is about expressing your core identity and your core needs. And when it forms a relationship with Neptune, it's calling for the exploration of you identifying and understanding what is your core purpose. Now, as a baby boomer, obviously you've lived maybe 60 years plus, or you're coming up to that point. And so obviously you've got stacks of experience behind you. And the same applies to people who are in younger generations. But when we're looking at the sun as a core identity and Neptune, the sun wants to remain defined. The sun wants to be really clear in terms of the direction that it's moving in. And its relationship with the moon is calling for a synergy between these 2 points. Whereas Neptune, and here is where you might be feeling this inner tension, Neptune is saying, well, I actually don't want you to have your own core separated identity. Neptune is about diffusing barriers, diffusing boundaries. And so where you have this tension point of a square, if you're somebody who has an inability to actually stand between the energy of Neptune, which is about diffusing boundaries, and its relationship with other planets, means that there's a weakness in terms of your own identity. And in order to navigate the journey of the Sun and Neptune, is that you must first form this relationship with yourself. Another indication of the sun in this new moon and the communication of it, obviously, because Mercury is there. Mercury is the messenger from the gods that brings down the messages from, to us mere mortals. And so with this new moon in Gemini, alongside the ruler, it's calling for you to bring about a new identity. What ideas are you sharing about who you are and the people around you, be them your friends, your family, your networks? It's about the sharing of ideas, but the ownership of your own ideas. Now, the sun also is a representation of your relationship with your father. So it's your literal father or father figures. And although you are, a mature adult as a baby boomer, have you been living part of your life where you have been faking it until you make it because of expectations that maybe, your father passed down to you and you've just automatically lived them, but you've lived them with a sense of dissatisfaction? Well, now that there's this relationship building up between the Sun and Neptune, it's a call for you to examine what does it actually mean in terms of what your needs are, and at what point can you stop faking it until you make it. You've got to step into your own personal power and own who it is that you actually are. And so once you're able to do that, then you can begin integrating Neptune in a far more positive way. So the tension that the square represents between the two planets begins to dissipate. And one of the ways that you can begin to explore the relationship of the Sun and Neptune is to think about what the sun represents. The sun represents love and creativity. Why? Because it rules Leo, and Leo rules the fifth house, which is about creativity and love. And it's your ability to be reveling in the nakedness of your creativity and your ability to demonstrate love. And the way that you can begin to do this is by pulling on Neptunian themes. So it might be a time whereby you are a therapist and you're going to be exploring creatively how you can heal yourself and other people. Or it could be that you're going to dip into your creativity. Neptune rules filmmaking and photography. Are you going to be storytelling about love and creativity using film and images? These are just some of the ways in which you can express yourself. Or are you going to write poetry? Are you pulled to write poetry? One of my favorite poets is Mark Nepo, and he's a philosophical poet and writes beautifully and extensively about the human condition from a love perspective. And so that's going to be a way of helping you to harmonize your identity so you can begin to share that with people around you in your local area, because Gemini and Mercury represents the local area, but also those in your network. So the work that you're called to do is to understand what is your core purpose and to imbibe Neptune from a very positive perspective, but once you're able to demarcate. Now, turning to the other face, the other luminary, we have the moon. And so the moon equally is forming a square with Neptune. Now, this is a little bit more problematic because on the one hand, the moon can actually associate quite comfortably with Neptune because they're both rule water signs. The moon rules Cancer and Neptune rules Pisces. So there's an element and a degree of sympathy and empathy and being compassionate. And the moon represents nourishment and nurturance. However, here's where Neptune can be really overwhelming for the moon in particular, because what it shows up, a square between the moon and Neptune, can point to an underlying sense of unhappiness, because you are so busy nurturing and nourishing other people in your world that you've stepped into the axis. And what that represents is the victim and the savior. Now, if you're always feeding other people because you're afraid to rock the boat, then you are being the savior of other people, but to the detriment of what your own needs are. So you are victimizing and you're self-sacrificing yourself. And here is where the resentment builds up. So as you're exploring this idea of faking it until you make it, always caring for other people, and once their needs are taken care of, then you can turn to yourself. But by then you're breeding resentment and hurt and pain because a part of your identity has been completely suppressed. This is the challenge for you with the moon forming a square to Neptune. So, what can you begin to do? What questions can you begin to ask yourself, particularly as a baby boomer or somebody who's certainly within the more mature ages? And the reason being is because the moon Neptune can lead to disappointment. Now, in our younger lives, when we hadn't had much experience, a sense of how do we handle the disappointments of life, we would just kind of fold into the situation. But as somebody who has lived certainly 5, 6, maybe 7 decades beyond, you would have gone through, or certainly going through, your second Saturn return. And Saturn is where, is the harsh teacher. What have we learnt about what life teaches us? And if you haven't strengthened your own core identity, then the relationship, be it with the sun, moon, in relationship to Neptune, is equally problematic. So the idea is, what lessons have you learned that enable you to take on board the lessons in which life can give us? And at what point are you now begin to nurture yourself? Now, the moon isn't about emotional wounding or a lack of emotional sustenance. And we now just need to pivot and look at Chiron. Chiron is the wounded healer, and Chiron is in Aries. And it's forming what is known as a sextile, meaning that there's an easy flow relationship that Chiron is applying to this new moon and Mercury. So there is this wonderful ease and opportunity of encouraging you to begin to heal those identity wounds. Why? Because Chiron is in Aries. And when Chiron is placed within Aries, it's always pointing to there's some type of wound psychologically or practically to the identity. And so with Mercury, the moon, and the sun forming this wonderful relationship, now's a fantastic time for you to be healing yourself. And by healing yourself, taking the time to do that, you can then coexist with Neptune, even though Neptune doesn't like relationships because it wants to overwhelm. But because you've catered to your own needs, then you're able to balance it. Now, if you're somebody who, let's say, for example, is too overwhelmed and too porous and taking in everybody's problems and situations and nourishing other people, what may show up in your life is, maybe addictions. It could be alcoholism, for example, or where you have allergies, and allergies could be pointed to where are you so sensitive in your life that you can't actually allow the outside world in. And one of the ways that can be reflected is through the food that you eat, because the moon is exalted in Taurus, and Taurus represents the body, but also food. And so if you have allergies showing up in your life, and they could be, long term or multiple allergies, what it could be pointing to is an undernourishment of yourself and an over mothering of other people. And hence why there is this sensitivity as to what you can allow into your world. But if you're using Chiron, the power of Chiron in Aries, this sense of, well, who is my identity? What is my identity? And actually, I want to be definitive with my identities, which means that I can then live in a very balanced way with what Neptune wants to bring to your attention. So we're seeing a public representation of how this faking it until you make it, and why it's so important that each and every one of us owns our own personal power. We only need to look at the debacle, the political debacle that's existed under this Tory government for the last 12 years here in the UK. And just very recently this week, we've seen, the nonsense that is Boris Johnson. Thank goodness that he resigned, because of Partygate that took place during, lockdown. And so this is represented because Pluto has just retrograded. Pluto is about transformation and power. It's gone back into the sign of Capricorn, which is very much about governance and the powers that be. Um, so it's retrograding back into Capricorn, which is a Saturn ruled sign. And it's reflecting on, how did the powers that be treat us? Now, Pluto is forming a relationship which is known as a quincunx. And this quincunx means there's an awkward connection between the sun and the moon as this new moon energy with power. But because Pluto is retrograding back into the sign of Capricorn, it's an invitation for us to call on our own personal power. And by owning our own personal power means that we can coexist with other entities and other energies. It's also being supported because Neptune is forming a sextile with Pluto, which is also about, this sense of being in the collective, but knowing how you can contribute towards this transformation that is needed. So that gives you the sense and the context of what's going on with this new moon in Gemini, wanting you to communicate this new identity, and for you to leave the diffusion or the victimhood or the self-sacrificing parts of yourself, so that you can begin to heal and own all aspects in terms of who you are. And then you can communicate that confidently, because the sun and the moon are in Gemini. So it's about clear, crisp, sometimes chatty conversation with other people, but it's in the sharing of your knowledge that helps you and other people. So that's what's been offered by this new moon in Gemini. And the question, for those of you who remember me doing my astrology shows a few years ago, I had the question of the day, and I'm going to bring back the question of the day starting today. And the question of the day is, given that you are a baby boomer, given that you are somebody that, has lived several decades, and your identity is being called upon in terms of how do you articulate this new sense of who you are, the question of the day is, what is your model of confident living? Now, for us as boomers in the later generation, i.e. those of us born, 62, 3, 4, I've been through my Saturn return, but those who are like 58, 59 this year, you are into your second Saturn return. So there are lessons you're learning, but there's lessons that you've learnt over the years. How do you integrate those lessons and created your own map, so to speak, of confident living? Now, the reason why this new moon in Gemini is inviting you to step in to answer this is because whatever solution you come up with has to be your own, because the sun and the moon are there, and the sun and the moon represent I. They still integrate the Leo principle of I am. So, what is your model of confident living? I'd love to hear it. Put it in the comment box below and share your ideas. Where is it that you are faking it until you make it? Now is the time to give that up, because it's underserving who you are, and it means that you are delaying getting your needs met. So that's what I wanted to share with you all. Feel free to like and share and subscribe to the channel. Share this information with other people, and I look forward to reading your responses and seeing you again next week here, Sunday, 3:30 on YouTube. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.